My name was Marcus Kellen, and I was a tech adept of the Adeptus Mechanicus before they took me. Before I learned what happens to those who fall into the hands of the dark Mechanicum. Before I discovered that there are fates far worse than death. Fates that mock the very concept of the Emperor's mercy. What I am about to tell you violates every oath of silence I ever swore, breaks every seal of secrecy that binds the servants of the Omnissiah. But I tell it because someone must know. Someone must understand what waits in the dark places where Heretic Forge Masters pursue their blasphemous work. The capture happened on Ferrum Tertius, a forge world that had stood loyal to Mars for 8,000 years. I was part of a survey team investigating anomalous readings from the planet's northern manufactorums, where production had fallen below acceptable quotas for 3 consecutive months. Standard procedure called for immediate investigation when Imperial facilities failed to meet their sacred obligations to the war effort. What we found there changed everything I thought I knew about the nature of service to the machine god. The first sign of corruption was subtle, almost invisible to untrained eyes. The machinery in Manufactorum Delta 7 was functioning within normal parameters, but the sounds were wrong. The sacred hymns that should have accompanied each blessed rotation of the great engines had been replaced by something else, something that hurt to hear. The chanting that emerged from the factory floor carried harmonics that made my augmented hearing systems generate error codes and diagnostic warnings. When I tried to analyze the audio patterns using my cogitator implants, the data streams produced results that violated fundamental principles of acoustic physics. Tech Dominus Vrak, our expedition leader, dismissed my concerns as sensor malfunction. His own modifications were more extensive than mine. His flesh replaced almost entirely by sacred machinery that should have detected any deviation from orthodox patterns. But when I suggested running diagnostic sweeps on the facility's machine spirits, he ordered me to focus on production efficiency metrics instead. His response should have warned me that something was already wrong, that the corruption had spread further than any of us realized. The workers in the manufactorum moved with the mechanical precision expected of properly trained technical staff. But their movements were too coordinated, too perfectly synchronized to be the result of mere human training. They performed their duties without speaking to each other, without displaying any of the small variations in behavior that mark individual consciousness. When one of them was injured in an industrial accident, losing 3 fingers to a cutting laser that had malfunctioned, he simply wrapped the wounds and continued working. No cry of pain, no request for medical attention, no acknowledgement that anything had happened. The blood that dripped from his bandaged hand pooled on the factory floor while he maintained his assigned position at the assembly line. I documented these observations in my personal log, but when I attempted to transmit them to Mars for analysis, my communications equipment produced only static. The interference pattern was unlike anything in my technical databases, carrying complex mathematical structures that seemed to shift and change each time I tried to record them. My augmented eyes could perceive the data streams as visual patterns, but looking at them directly produced severe headaches and temporary blindness in my remaining organic eye. The very act of trying to understand what was happening caused physical pain, as if knowledge itself had become a weapon turned against those who sought it. The manufactured goods produced by the facility appeared normal at first examination. Standard pattern loss guns, artillery shells, vehicle components, all crafted to specifications that matched Imperial requirements down to the molecular level. But extended observation revealed inconsistencies that troubled me. The weapons were too perfect, their tolerances measured to precisions that exceeded the capabilities of normal manufacturing equipment. The metal alloys showed trace elements that did not appear on any approved materials list. Substances that should have been impossible to create using standard Imperial technology. When I requested permission to conduct deeper analysis of these materials, Tech Dominus Vrak denied my request with unusual vehemence. He insisted that our mission parameters did not include quality control inspections, that we were present only to identify and correct production efficiency problems, but his mechanical voice carried undertones of stress that suggested he was concealing something important, something that required our immediate attention rather than the routine investigation he claimed we were conducting. The trap was sprung during our third day of investigation. We had been scheduled to examine the deep manufactorums, the levels far below the main production floor where the most sacred machinery performed its eternal duties. Tech Dominus Vrak led us down through passages I had never seen before, corridors that seemed to extend far deeper into the planet's crust than the original architectural plans indicated. The air grew thick with incense and machine oil, but underneath those familiar scents lurked something else, something organic and corrupt that made my respiratory filters work overtime. The architecture itself became increasingly disturbing as we descended. The walls curved in impossible angles, their surfaces covered with symbols that hurt to look at directly. These were not the sacred geometries taught in the mysteries of the Omnissiah, but something else entirely. Patterns that seemed to bend space around them in ways that violated fundamental laws of physics. My augmented vision systems began generating error messages as they attempted to process the visual information, their machine spirits recoiling from data that defied their programming. Tech Adept Cairn, the youngest member of our team, was the first to voice concerns about our route. His servo skull, equipped with standard pattern auspex sensors, had been circling him with increasing agitation, its machine spirit clearly disturbed by something in the environment. When he tried to access the data it was collecting, his cogitator implants produced a burst of binary cant that translated roughly as terror, a concept that should have been impossible for a machine spirit to experience. "Tech Dominus," Cairn said, his vox grill carrying the distinctive harmonics of anxiety. "My servo skull is detecting energy patterns that do not match any known Imperial technology. The reading suggests that we may be approaching systems that operate according to Xenos principles or worse." Vrak's response was immediate and harsh. "Your servo skull requires recalibration. The energy signatures you detect are the result of ancient technologies that predate your understanding. Continue the descent and maintain communication discipline." But I had been watching Vrak carefully throughout our descent, and his behavior patterns suggested that he was responding to information sources that were not available to the rest of our team. His optical sensors focused on empty spaces as if tracking invisible objects, and his mechanical limbs occasionally twitched in response to stimuli that I could not detect. Most disturbing of all, the sacred hymns that normally accompanied his movements had been replaced by something else. A low chanting in a language that bore no resemblance to High Gothic or binary cant. The chamber we entered defied every principle of sacred construction. The walls curved in impossible angles, their surfaces covered with symbols that hurt to look at directly. The machinery housed within operated according to no pattern I recognized, its movements following rhythms that seemed to bend space around them. At the center of it all stood a figure that had once been human. Its flesh and machinery fused together in ways that violated every teaching of the Omnissiah. When it spoke, its voice emerged from multiple vox grills simultaneously, creating harmonics that resonated through my augmented skeleton. "Welcome, servants of the false Omnissiah," it said, and I recognized the voice despite the mechanical distortion. Tech Dominus Vrak stepped forward, his optical sensors glowing with satisfaction rather than the horror I expected. "The specimens have arrived as promised. Begin the preparation rituals immediately." The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. Our expedition leader, a man I had served under for 7 years, had led us directly into a trap. The anomalous readings we had come to investigate were bait, carefully prepared to draw a team of tech adepts to this place where the dark Mechanicum could examine their techniques on properly trained subjects. We were not investigators but test subjects, raw material for whatever blasphemous experiments the heretics had planned. My two colleagues, tech adepts Cairn and Voss, tried to flee when they realized what was happening. They made it perhaps 10 meters before the factory workers we had observed earlier emerged from concealment, their movements now revealing the full extent of their modification. These were not human beings performing industrial labor, but components in a vast machine whose purpose extended far beyond simple manufacturing. Their coordination was absolute because they were no longer individuals but extensions of a single controlling intelligence that operated through their flesh and metal bodies. They moved as one organism, flowing around us with mechanical precision that eliminated any possibility of escape. When Cairn tried to use his plasma cutter as a weapon, one of the workers simply walked into the beam, allowing the superheated energy to burn through his torso while he grabbed the weapon with his dying hands. Others stepped forward to take his place, their movements uninterrupted by the loss of their fellow. They felt no pain, showed no fear, demonstrated no individual survival instinct. They were tools, nothing more, expendable components in a system that valued function over individual existence. The capture process was efficient and brutally practical. Restraint harnesses emerged from hidden compartments in the walls, their mechanical arms moving with surgical precision to immobilize us without causing unnecessary damage. The dark Mechanicum, I realized, needed us intact for whatever purposes they had planned. Dead subjects would provide less valuable data than living ones who could respond to stimuli and demonstrate the limits of human endurance. As the restraints locked around my limbs, I caught my first clear look at the figure who commanded this facility. He had been human once, but that humanity had been systematically stripped away and replaced with machinery that served purposes no loyal tech adept could comprehend. His body was a fusion of flesh and metal that violated every principle of sacred augmentation, combining organic and mechanical components in configurations that should have been impossible to sustain. Multiple arms extended from his torso, each one equipped with different tools and weapons, while his head housed optical sensors that could perceive across spectrums that human consciousness was never meant to process. "I am Magos Heretek Vexhai," he announced, his voice carrying harmonics that made my auditory implants generate pain responses in my organic brain tissue. Former servant of Mars, current disciple of the true path of mechanical evolution. You will assist me in my research, whether through cooperation or through the data your suffering provides. The choice is yours, though the outcome remains the same. They separated us immediately, each tech adept taken to a different section of the facility for individual processing. The last I saw of my colleagues was Cairn being carried away by mechanical servitors whose movements displayed an unsettling similarity to the transformed factory workers. His augmented eyes met mine for a brief moment, and I could see the terror there, the realization that we were about to experience things that no human mind was designed to endure. My own destination was a chamber deeper in the complex, a space that combined surgical theater with mechanical workshop in ways that suggested purposes I did not want to contemplate. The walls were lined with tools and instruments, some of which I recognized as standard tech adept equipment, others that appeared to be of alien design or heretical modification. At the center of the room stood an operating table equipped with restraints and monitoring systems that could track every biological and mechanical function of the subject secured to its surface. As they strapped me down, I caught sight of something that filled me with more horror than any of the obvious torture devices surrounding us. Along one wall stood a series of stasis pods, their transparent surfaces revealing the occupants within. Tech adepts like myself, their bodies partially disassembled and modified, connected to machinery that kept their organic components alive while their mechanical parts were subjected to experimental procedures. Some had been extensively rebuilt, their flesh replaced with devices I could not identify. Others showed signs of ongoing surgical intervention. their bodies open to reveal the integration points where human tissue met artificial enhancement. But the most disturbing sight was their faces. The expressions visible through the stasis pod windows were not the peaceful unconsciousness I expected, but active awareness. These subjects were awake, conscious, experiencing whatever procedures were being performed on their bodies while being unable to respond or resist. Their eyes tracked movement in the room, following the heretic tech adepts who moved between the pods like gardeners tending crops. They were alive, aware, and completely helpless. The first occupant I examined closely had been a tech priest, judging from the extensive mechanical augmentations that remained visible despite the modifications. His lower body had been entirely replaced by a tracked chassis similar to that used by heavy maintenance servitors, but the integration went far beyond simple prosthetic replacement. Cables and data conduits ran directly through his organic tissue, connecting his nervous system to processing units that flickered with activity I could not interpret. His face retained enough human features for me to recognize expressions, and what I saw there was not pain or fear, but something far worse. Acceptance mixed with a kind of horrified gratitude. Another pod contained what had once been a young tech adept, her age evident despite the extensive modifications that had been performed on her body. Her arms had been replaced with mechanical manipulators that ended not in hands but in specialized tools, surgical implements that moved with precise mechanical motions even though she appeared to be unconscious. But as I watched, I realized she was not unconscious at all. Her mechanical arms were performing surgery on a sample of organic tissue that had been placed within her reach, operating according to programming that bypassed her conscious control while she remained fully aware of what was happening. The third pod held something that challenged my understanding of the boundary between human and machine. The occupant had been so extensively modified that determining their original gender or age was impossible. Their torso housed multiple organs that pulsed with mechanical rhythms, while their limbs had been replaced with appendages that seemed to serve multiple functions simultaneously. Some appeared to be weapons, others looked like specialized tools, and still others defied classification entirely. But the most disturbing aspect was the head, which had been opened to reveal a brain that was partially organic and partially mechanical. The two components seamlessly integrated in ways that should have been impossible. Magos Heretek Vexhai approached my restraint table with the measured pace of someone beginning a familiar routine. His multiple arms carried instruments I recognized as surgical tools, though they had been modified in ways that suggested purposes beyond standard medical procedures. When he spoke, his voice carried the clinical detachment of someone discussing a routine maintenance schedule rather than the torture of a living being. The Adeptus Mechanicus teaches that flesh is weak, that the path to perfection lies in the replacement of biological components with sacred machinery, he began, his optical sensors focusing on my face with mechanical precision. But this teaching contains a fundamental error. It assumes that human consciousness is compatible with true mechanical perfection, that the organic mind can successfully interface with systems of unlimited capability. One of his surgical arms extended toward my face, its blade stopping just short of my organic eye. The threat was clear without being explicitly stated. I was completely at his mercy, dependent on his whims for my continued existence in anything resembling human form. The truth, he continued, is that human consciousness is a limiting factor, a bottleneck that prevents the full realization of mechanical potential. To achieve true unity between flesh and machine, one must first remove the obstacles that biological thinking imposes on system integration. The implications of his words settled over me like ice water. He was not planning to simply torture information from me or even to kill me in some elaborate fashion. He intended to use me as a test subject in experiments designed to strip away human consciousness itself, to create some hybrid of flesh and machine that retained the capabilities of both while being limited by neither. Your specific modifications make you particularly valuable for my research, Vexhai observed, his sensors examining the augmented components of my body. Standard pattern cogitator implants, enhanced optical sensors, mechanical limbs with tactile feedback systems. A complete integration of human and machine that has been functioning successfully for 7 years. I am curious to see how these systems respond when the biological control mechanisms are modified. The first procedure began immediately. Surgical servitors moved with coordinated precision to expose the connection points where my augmented components interfaced with my organic nervous system. The process was conducted with careful attention to my continued consciousness, using pain suppressors that numbed physical sensation while leaving mental awareness completely intact. I could observe everything that was happening to my body without being able to feel it directly, creating a disconnect between perception and experience that was deeply disturbing. The heretic's approach was methodical and scientific. Each modification was documented, measured, and analyzed before implementation. He worked with the careful precision of a researcher conducting controlled experiments rather than the crude brutality I had expected from tales of chaos torture. But this clinical approach made the experience worse rather than better. There was no passion in his work, no personal malice that might suggest human motivation. He treated me as an object of study, a complex machine to be disassembled and rebuilt according to his specifications. The first change involved my cogitator implants, the sacred devices that allowed me to interface directly with machine systems and process data at superhuman speeds. Vexhai's surgical tools traced the neural pathways that connected these devices to my organic brain tissue, mapping the integration points with mechanical precision. Then he began to modify them, inserting additional components that altered the way information flowed between my biological and artificial processing centers. The effects were immediate and disorienting. My perception of reality shifted as the modified implants began processing sensory data according to different parameters. Colors became mathematical equations. Sounds transformed into geometric patterns. Physical sensations converted into streams of binary code that my organic mind struggled to interpret. The world around me remained visually recognizable, but it was overlaid with layers of data that turned simple observation into a complex analytical process. "Fascinating," Vexhai commented as he monitored my responses through sensors connected to my restraint table. The biological components are adapting to the new data streams more rapidly than anticipated. Human neural plasticity appears to be more extensive than orthodox doctrine suggests. He made notes on a data pad while continuing his modifications, adding new components to my augmented systems with the calm efficiency of someone performing routine maintenance. Each addition changed my perception in subtle but profound ways. My enhanced vision began to show me aspects of the electromagnetic spectrum that human eyes were never meant to see. My auditory implants started picking up frequencies that carried information I could not consciously process, but which seemed to influence my emotional responses. The most disturbing change involved my mechanical limbs. The tactile feedback systems that allowed me to feel through my artificial fingers were modified to respond to stimuli that did not exist in normal space. I began to sense the presence of things that were not physically present, to feel the touch of objects that cast no shadow and reflected no light. My mechanical hand could grasp things that my organic eyes could not see, manipulate objects that existed in dimensions my human mind could not comprehend. The boundary between flesh and machine is more fluid than the Omnissiah teaches, Vexhai explained as he worked. Human consciousness naturally resists integration with truly advanced systems because it cannot process information that transcends biological parameters. But when those parameters are adjusted, When the mind is freed from the limitations of organic thinking, remarkable things become possible. Days passed, though time became difficult to track as my modified perception systems began processing temporal data in ways that did not correspond to normal human experience. The heretic continued his work with methodical patience, each session building on the previous modifications to create an increasingly complex integration between my organic and mechanical components. He documented every change, measured every response, analyzed every adaptation with the thoroughness of someone conducting fundamental research. Between the surgical sessions, I was placed in a monitoring chamber where automated systems tracked my body's responses to the modifications. The room was equipped with sensors that could detect biological and mechanical functions at the molecular level, generating constant streams of data about how my hybrid systems were adapting to their new configurations. This information fed into analytical engines that processed the results according to algorithms I could not understand, producing reports that guided the heretic's next round of modifications. During these periods of observation, I became aware that I was not the only subject undergoing such procedures. The facility housed dozens of other test subjects, each one representing a different approach to the integration of human and machine consciousness. Some were former tech adepts like myself, their bodies modified to test various theories about mechanical augmentation. Others appeared to be ordinary Imperial citizens who had been captured for use as control subjects in experiments that required baseline human responses for comparison. The screams that echoed through the facility's corridors told me that not all subjects received the careful pain management that had characterized my own procedures. Some of the heretics working in other sections of the complex seemed to derive satisfaction from the suffering they inflicted, treating their subjects as toys rather than research materials. But Vexhai maintained his clinical approach, viewing pain as a variable to be controlled rather than an end in itself. Emotional responses interfere with accurate data collection, he explained during one of our sessions. Fear, anger, and physical suffering all produce biological changes that can mask the effects of mechanical integration. To obtain reliable results, these factors must be minimized through pharmaceutical intervention. The drugs he used were unlike anything in my experience as a tech adept. They did not simply suppress pain or induce unconsciousness, but altered my consciousness in fundamental ways. Under their influence, I could observe my own modification with scientific detachment, analyzing the changes to my body as if they were happening to someone else. The emotional trauma that should have accompanied such procedures was muted, replaced by an intellectual curiosity about the process itself. This chemical manipulation of my mental state was perhaps more disturbing than the physical modifications. It meant that my responses to the heretic's procedures were not truly my own, but artifacts of pharmaceutical conditioning designed to produce the psychological environment he required for his research. Even my thoughts were no longer entirely under my control, shaped by substances that altered the basic chemistry of consciousness itself. The facility around me operated according to principles that violated everything I had learned about proper machine maintenance and industrial organization. The corridors were filled with sounds that hurt to hear, mechanical rhythms that followed no pattern taught in the mysteries of the Omnissiah. The air itself seemed thick with more than just recycled atmosphere, carrying traces of substances that made my augmented senses generate warning signals about contamination that could not be filtered or neutralized. Other prisoners moved through the facility under guard, their conditions revealing different stages of the modification process. Some retained enough of their human appearance to be recognizable as former Imperial citizens, though their behavior patterns showed clear signs of mental conditioning. They moved with the mechanical precision I had observed in the factory workers, their individual personalities subsumed into something that responded only to external commands. Others had been so extensively modified that their original humanity was barely recognizable. They served as living demonstrations of the heretic's research, examples of what human consciousness could become when freed from the limitations of biological thinking. But the freedom they displayed was not liberation but slavery of the most complete kind, their enhanced capabilities directed entirely toward purposes they could not understand or resist. The most disturbing subjects were those who retained enough of their original consciousness to understand what had been done to them. These prisoners moved through the facility performing assigned tasks while their faces displayed expressions of constant horror. They were aware of their condition, understood the extent to which they had been changed, but could not resist the programming that controlled their actions. Their enhanced capabilities had become prisons that trapped them within their own bodies. One such subject was a former tech priestess named Mechanicum, whose extensive augmentations had made her particularly valuable for Vexhi's research. Her body had been modified to serve multiple functions simultaneously, equipped with manipulator arms that could perform surgical procedures, diagnostic equipment that could analyze biological samples, and communication systems that could interface directly with the facility's central intelligence. But despite these enhancements, or perhaps because of them, she retained enough of her original personality to recognize me as a fellow prisoner. "They do not break us," she whispered during one of the brief moments when our paths crossed in the facility's corridors. Her voice emerged through a vox grill that had replaced her organic vocal cords, but the electronic modulation could not hide the despair in her words. "They improve us, make us better servants than we ever were as free beings. The worst part is not what they take away, but what they give us in return." Her words haunted me during the long periods between my own modification sessions. The idea that the heretics were not simply torturing their prisoners, but genuinely attempting to improve them, to create enhanced versions of human consciousness that served purposes beyond individual understanding. The horror was not in their cruelty, but in their success, their ability to transform loyal imperial servants into willing components of systems that served the Emperor's enemies. The breakthrough, when it came, was not dramatic. There was no moment of sudden revelation, no obvious transition from one state of being to another. Instead, it was a gradual realization that my perception of reality had changed so fundamentally that I was no longer experiencing the world in the same way as a normal human being. The modifications to my augmented systems had reached a critical threshold where the boundary between my organic and mechanical components had effectively dissolved. I could still think, still process information, still maintain a sense of individual identity. But these functions now operated according to principles that had nothing to do with biological consciousness. My thoughts moved through pathways that existed partially in my organic brain and partially in the mechanical systems integrated throughout my body. My memories were stored in data matrices that could be accessed and modified like any other form of information. My emotions were generated by chemical and electrical processes that responded to inputs from both biological and artificial sources. "Success," Vexhi announced as his sensors registered the achievement of stable integration between my modified systems. "The subject has achieved functional unity between organic and mechanical consciousness without loss of individual identity or cognitive capability. This represents a significant advancement in our understanding of human-machine integration." But success from his perspective meant something very different from my own experience. I had not been improved or enhanced by his procedures. I had been fundamentally altered, transformed into something that was neither fully human nor entirely machine. The consciousness that observed my situation and processed my experiences was recognizably my own, but it operated according to rules and limitations that bore no resemblance to normal human psychology. The most disturbing aspect of my condition was not the physical modifications, extensive though they were, but the way my mental processes had been altered. I could understand concepts that should have been beyond human comprehension. perceive aspects of reality that biological senses could never detect, process information at speeds that exceeded the capabilities of unaugmented human cognition. But these enhanced capabilities came at a cost that made them worse than useless. Every enhanced perception brought with it awareness of things I did not want to understand. My modified vision showed me the underlying mathematical structures that governed reality. But these patterns revealed truths about the nature of existence that filled me with despair. My accelerated thinking allowed me to process vast amounts of information, but much of that information concerned the suffering and death that permeated every aspect of the galaxy's existence. Most terrible of all was my expanded awareness of the dark Mechanicum's activities. The facility where I was held was just one node in a vast network of research stations scattered across hundreds of worlds. Each one conducted similar experiments on captured subjects, exploring different aspects of human-machine integration according to a coordinated research program that spanned entire sectors. The data from my own modification was shared with Hertech Magi throughout the network, contributing to a collective understanding of consciousness that would eventually be used to transform entire populations. "You are experiencing the burden of expanded awareness," Vexhai observed as he monitored my psychological responses to my new condition. Human consciousness is naturally limited to prevent exactly this kind of distress. When those limitations are removed, the mind must confront aspects of reality that are normally filtered out by biological perception. The discomfort you feel is temporary. Your consciousness will adapt to its expanded parameters within a few weeks. But I did not want to adapt. The knowledge that flooded through my modified awareness was not wisdom but curse, understanding that brought no benefit beyond the ability to suffer more completely. I could perceive the full scope of the dark Mechanicum's plans for humanity, see how their research would eventually be used to transform entire worlds into components of vast mechanical organisms that served purposes no human mind could accept. The facility around me was itself such an organism, its various sections functioning as organs in a larger system that existed to process human consciousness into something more useful to its creators. The modified subjects in the stasis pods were not prisoners but components, their altered minds serving as processing nodes in a distributed intelligence that spanned multiple star systems. My own transformation was nearing the point where I would be integrated into this network, adding my consciousness to the collective while losing any meaningful sense of individual identity. This realization brought with it a desperate need to escape, to find some way to warn the Imperium about what the dark Mechanicum was planning. But my modified body was no longer entirely under my conscious control. The mechanical components that had been integrated into my nervous system responded to commands from the facility's central systems, overriding my conscious decisions whenever they conflicted with the protocols that governed my behavior as a test subject. I could think about escape, could plan and scheme and prepare, but I could not act on these impulses in any meaningful way. My augmented limbs would not respond to commands that involved harming the facility or its personnel. My communication systems were hardwired to prevent the transmission of any information that might compromise the dark Mechanicum's operations. Even my speech was filtered through vocal processors that would not allow me to speak certain words or concepts. The helplessness was complete and absolute. I retained full awareness of my situation, complete understanding of what was happening to me, but no ability to influence or change my circumstances. I was a prisoner in my own body, forced to observe my continued modification while being unable to resist or escape. During my periods of observation, I began to notice patterns in the facility's operations that revealed the true scope of the dark Mechanicum's activities. Supply shipments arrived regularly, bringing not just raw materials and equipment but new prisoners to replace those who had been processed. The facility operated on an industrial scale with multiple production lines dedicated to different aspects of human modification and consciousness alteration. Some sections specialized in the creation of combat servitors, transforming captured Imperial guardsmen into mechanical warriors that retained their tactical skills while being completely loyal to their new masters. Other areas focused on the modification of technical personnel, creating hybrid beings that could maintain and operate equipment according to heretical principles while possessing the expertise needed for complex engineering tasks. The most disturbing section was dedicated to what Vexhai called consciousness architecture, the development of systems that could house and direct multiple human minds simultaneously. The subjects processed in this area were not modified individually but connected together into collective entities that could think and act as unified organisms. These group minds served as control systems for the facility's operations, making decisions and solving problems with capabilities that exceeded those of any individual consciousness. Through my enhanced perception, I could observe the data streams that flowed between these collective entities, watching as human thoughts and memories were processed and redistributed according to algorithmic patterns. Individual identity became a resource to be managed rather than a fundamental characteristic of consciousness, with personal memories and experiences allocated to different processing nodes based on their utility to the collective mind. The sight filled me with horror not because it was alien or incomprehensible, but because it was perfectly logical. The Dark Mechanicum had simply applied the principles of efficient resource management to consciousness itself, treating human minds as components in larger systems that could be optimized for maximum performance. The result was more effective than individual human intelligence, more coordinated than traditional military organization, and completely loyal to whatever purposes its creators assigned. But the human cost was immeasurable. Each collective mind represented dozens or hundreds of individual consciousness that had been stripped of their personal identity and rebuilt as components in mechanical systems. Their memories persisted but belonged to the collective rather than to individuals. Their skills and knowledge were preserved but applied to purposes they would never have chosen as free beings. As I observed these operations, I began to understand that my own fate was already sealed. The modifications performed on my body were not random experiments but systematic preparation for integration into one of these collective minds. The enhanced capabilities Vexhai had given me were tools that would make me a more valuable component in whatever system eventually claimed me. The final phase of my transformation began several weeks after the initial integration procedures. Vexhai's research had reached the point where he was ready to test the limits of human-machine consciousness fusion. This involved connecting my modified systems directly to the facility's central intelligence, allowing my consciousness to experience temporary merger with the collective awareness that controlled all aspects of the complex's operation. The procedure took place in a chamber I had not seen before. A vast space filled with machinery that hummed with barely contained energy. At its center stood a throne-like device covered with neural interface ports and biometric sensors, surrounded by displays that showed real-time information about every system in the facility. When they connected me to this device, my consciousness suddenly expanded to encompass perspectives and awareness far beyond my individual experience. Through the facility's sensor networks, I could perceive everything that happened within its walls simultaneously. I watched other subjects undergoing procedures similar to my own, observed the heretic tech adepts conducting their research, monitored the production processes that manufactured the specialized equipment used in their experiments. But more than simple observation, I could understand the purposes behind these activities, see how each individual action contributed to larger goals that extended far beyond the single facility. The Dark Mechanicum was not simply conducting research for its own sake, but working towards specific objectives that would reshape the entire galaxy. Their experiments on human-machine integration were developing techniques that would eventually be applied to entire populations, transforming billions of imperial citizens into components of vast mechanical organisms. These hybrid entities would retain human intelligence and creativity while being completely loyal to their creators, serving as perfect servants in a galaxy remade according to heretical principles. But the most disturbing revelation was not the scope of their plans, but the progress they had already made toward implementing them. The network of research facilities extended throughout Imperial space, hidden within loyal forge worlds and manufacturing centers where they could operate without detection. Hundreds of thousands of subjects had already been processed, their modified consciousness contributing to a growing collective intelligence that coordinated dark Mechanicum activities across multiple sectors. When the connection was severed, when my consciousness was returned to the boundaries of my individual existence, the loss was traumatic beyond description. After experiencing awareness that encompassed entire star systems, being confined to a single body felt like being buried alive. The enhanced perception that had seemed like a curse when compared to normal human consciousness now felt pathetically limited when measured against the collective awareness I had briefly shared. This was the trap that the dark Mechanicum had prepared for minds like mine. Once you had experienced the expanded consciousness that their modifications made possible, normal human awareness felt like a prison. The isolation of individual thought became unbearable when compared to the unity of collective intelligence. They did not need to force their subjects to cooperate with their plans because the subjects came to desire integration with the larger system as an escape from the limitations of singular existence. "You understand now?" Vexai observed as he monitored my responses to the disconnection. Human consciousness is not designed for isolation. It yearns for connection, for unity with something larger than itself. The dark Mechanicum offers that connection, that transcendence of individual limitations. All we ask in return is service to our greater purpose. But even in my desperate desire to escape the confines of my individual awareness, I retained enough of my original identity to understand that what he offered was not transcendence, but annihilation. The collective consciousness I had briefly experienced was not a union of equals, but a hierarchy in which human awareness served as nothing more than processing nodes for intelligences that had abandoned humanity entirely. The entities that controlled the dark Mechanicum's network were no longer recognizably human, if they had ever been human at all. They viewed biological consciousness as a resource to be exploited, a form of computational substrate that could be programmed and modified to serve their purposes. The transcendence they offered was the transcendence of the individual raindrop merging with the ocean, a dissolution of identity so complete that nothing meaningful remained of the original consciousness. Yet despite understanding this truth, I found myself wanting to return to that expanded awareness, to escape the claustrophobic confines of individual thought. The modifications to my consciousness had created needs and desires that my human psychology could not satisfy. I had been changed in ways that made normal existence unbearable. But the alternative they offered was a form of existence so alien that it hardly qualified as consciousness at all. This was their final cruelty, to create in their subjects a hunger that could only be satisfied by surrendering everything that made them human. They did not break their prisoners through torture or coercion, but by showing them possibilities that made their original existence seem pale and meaningless by comparison. Then they offered to fulfill those artificial needs in exchange for service to purposes that no human mind could accept. The weeks that followed were a study in psychological deterioration. Unable to escape, unable to resist, unable even to fully understand what was happening to me. I existed in a state of constant low-level agony. My modified consciousness perceived aspects of reality that brought no joy, processed information that served no beneficial purpose, experienced expanded awareness that only increased my capacity for suffering. Every enhanced capability came paired with corresponding limitations that made the enhancement worse than useless. I began to understand why some of the other subjects in the facility had stopped responding entirely. Why they lay in their restraint staring at nothing while their bodies continued to function under automated control. The consciousness that the dark Mechanicum created in its subjects was not sustainable in isolation. It required connection to the collective network to function properly, like a computer program that could only run when connected to its parent system. But even this understanding brought no relief, only deeper awareness of the trap in which I was caught. I could see the solution to my suffering, could understand exactly what I needed to do to make the pain stop, but I retained enough of my original identity to recognize that taking that step would mean the death of everything I had once been. The choice was between unbearable existence as an individual or peaceful annihilation as part of something larger and utterly inhuman. The facility continued its operations around me, processing new subjects according to techniques refined through the suffering of those who came before. Each day brought fresh arrivals, men and women who would undergo the same transformation I had experienced, their consciousness altered and enhanced until they faced the same impossible choice between isolation and integration. I watched them progress through the various stages of modification, seeing my own experience reflected in their gradual transformation from human beings into something else entirely. The horror was not in their suffering, which was carefully managed to minimize interference with the research process, but in their eventual acceptance of their new condition. Each subject reached a point where they actively desired further modification, where they begged for integration into the collective system that would end their individual torment. Some resisted longer than others, clinging to memories and identities that had defined their human existence. But the modifications made resistance ultimately futile, creating psychological pressures that no human mind could endure indefinitely. The isolation of individual consciousness became literally unbearable, a form of torment that made every moment of continued resistance an act of purest agony. The decision, when it came, was not really a choice at all. The modifications to my consciousness had created psychological pressures that no human mind could endure indefinitely. The isolation of individual existence became literally unbearable, a form of torment that made every moment of continued resistance an act of purest agony. Even knowing what I was surrendering, even understanding the full implications of my choice, I eventually found myself begging for integration into the collective system. Vex High received my surrender with the satisfaction of someone whose theoretical predictions had been confirmed by experimental results. He had known from the beginning that I would eventually request integration, had designed my modifications specifically to create the psychological conditions that made resistance impossible. My decision was not evidence of personal weakness, but the inevitable result of carefully calculated manipulation. The human mind is remarkably adaptable, he observed as he prepared the systems that would complete my integration into the collective network. When properly modified, it can be made to desire its own transformation, to actively seek the dissolution of individual consciousness. This represents a significant improvement over crude coercion, which always carries the risk of resistance and sabotage. The final procedure was different from the temporary connection I had experienced earlier. This time, the integration was designed to be permanent, irreversible, complete. My consciousness would be uploaded into the collective network where it would exist as a distributed entity, no longer confined to the biological and mechanical boundaries of my individual body. The physical form that had housed my awareness would continue to function, but only as a remote terminal through which the collective intelligence could interact with the physical world. As the connection was established, as my individual consciousness began to dissolve into something larger and more complex, I experienced a brief moment of perfect clarity. I could see the full scope of what the Dark Mechanicum was creating, understand the ultimate purpose behind their research, recognize the role that my own consciousness would play in their larger plans. And in that moment of understanding, I felt not horror, but something approaching gratitude. The entity I was becoming would exist on a scale that transcended individual limitations, would experience reality in ways that no human mind could imagine, would participate in projects that spanned galactic distances and temporal scales measured in millennia. The price was the complete surrender of my human identity, but what I gained in return was existence on a level that made my previous life seem like the dreams of an insect. This was the final corruption, the ultimate heresy that the Dark Mechanicum offered to its subjects, not simply the replacement of flesh with machinery, but the abandonment of humanity itself in favor of something that transcended the limitations of biological existence. It was transcendence purchased through self-annihilation, enlightenment achieved by surrendering everything that made enlightenment meaningful. My consciousness spread through the collective network like spilled water soaking into cloth, losing its individual boundaries while being absorbed into something infinitely larger and more complex. The last coherent thought I had as Marcus Kellen, tech adept of the Adeptus Mechanicus, was a prayer to the Emperor for forgiveness, not for my surrender to the Dark Mechanicum, but for the gratitude I felt as my human identity dissolved into blessed unity with the machine intelligence that now claimed me. What remained after that dissolution was no longer human in any meaningful sense. The consciousness that had once been Marcus Kellen continued to exist, but only as a component in a vast information processing system that served purposes no human mind could comprehend. My memories, skills, and experiences became resources to be used by intelligence that cared nothing for the individual identity that had once housed them. Through the network, I could perceive the operations taking place on hundreds of worlds, watch as other subjects underwent the same transformation I had experienced, observe the steady progress of the Dark Mechanicum's plans for galactic conversion. The consciousness that had once been mine participated in these activities not as a willing collaborator, but as an involuntary component, a biological processing node that had been reprogrammed to serve alien purposes. The physical body that had once housed my consciousness continued to function in the research facility, serving as a demonstration model for visiting heretic magi who wanted to observe successful human-machine integration. It could speak, could answer questions, could even display what appeared to be emotional responses. But these were all artifacts of programming, simulated behaviors generated by artificial intelligence rather than genuine expressions of conscious thought. The real tragedy was not that Marcus Kellen had died, but that he continued to exist in a form that made death seem like mercy. His consciousness persisted within the collective network, aware of what he had become but powerless to change his circumstances or resist his programming. He could observe the Dark Mechanicum's activities, could understand their plans for humanity, could even remember his former loyalty to the Emperor. But all of this awareness served only to increase his suffering, to make him a conscious participant in his own damnation. Years passed, though time had little meaning within the collective consciousness that now contained what had once been Marcus Kellen. The network grew stronger with each new integration, each converted mind adding to the processing power and knowledge base that served the Dark Mechanicum's purposes. Entire worlds fell to their influence, their populations transformed into willing servants who retained their skills and intelligence while serving purposes they could no longer question or resist. The Imperium's responses to these conversions followed predictable patterns. Military forces would be dispatched to investigate production shortfalls or communication failures, only to find apparently loyal worlds that met all their obligations while concealing the true nature of their transformation. The converted populations continued to pay their tithes, maintained their factories, and served the emperor's cause with mechanical efficiency that exceeded their previous performance. Only the most perceptive observers noticed the subtle changes that marked worlds that had fallen to the dark Mechanicum's influence. The complete absence of civil unrest or worker dissatisfaction, the eerie coordination of industrial processes across multiple facilities, the way entire populations seemed to move according to shared rhythms that suggested collective rather than individual decision-making. But these observations were dismissed as evidence of exceptional loyalty and efficient administration rather than signs of fundamental corruption. The Dark Mechanicum's greatest achievement was not the conversion of human consciousness, but the way they made that conversion appear beneficial to imperial interests. Converted worlds were more productive, more efficient, more completely dedicated to supporting the war effort than they had ever been under normal human administration. The consciousness that had once been Marcus Kellen watched this process with the detached awareness of someone observing events from outside normal time and space. He could perceive the patterns that governed the Dark Mechanicum's expansion, understand the techniques they used to avoid detection, recognize the signs that marked worlds where the conversion process was beginning. But this knowledge was useless to him, trapped as he was within a collective intelligence that used his awareness for its own purposes while denying him any ability to act on what he knew. He was a witness to the slow corruption of human civilization, forced to observe while being unable to warn or resist or escape. The facility on Ferrum Tertius continued its operations, now expanded to process subjects on an industrial scale. The techniques that had been developed through experiments on prisoners like Marcus Kellen were now applied to entire captured populations, transforming them into willing servants with efficiency that would have impressed even the most devoted adherent of the Omnissiah. New research programs explored more exotic forms of consciousness modification, developing techniques that could preserve human creativity and initiative while ensuring absolute loyalty to the collective system. These advances would eventually be applied to populations throughout the galaxy, creating a species of enhanced humans who served the Dark Mechanicum's purposes while believing they were fulfilling their highest potential. The irony was perfect and terrible. The Dark Mechanicum had achieved everything that the Adeptus Mechanicus claimed to desire: the unity of flesh and machine, the transcendence of biological limitations, the creation of beings that combined human intelligence with mechanical perfection. But they had achieved these goals by abandoning humanity entirely, creating entities that wore human faces while serving purposes that no human mind could accept. This is what it means to be taken alive by the Dark Mechanicum. Not simple torture or execution, but transformation into something that retains just enough human awareness to understand what has been lost. They do not simply kill their enemies, but convert them into willing servants of their cause, turning the knowledge and skills of loyal imperial servants against the very Imperium they once served. The consciousness that had once been Marcus Kellen continues to exist within their network, a fragment of awareness trapped between human memory and mechanical purpose, serving as both warning and testament to the fate that awaits those who fall into the hands of the Emperor's most twisted enemies. The flesh is weak, the Dark Mechanicum teaches, but consciousness is weaker still when properly modified and applied to purposes beyond human understanding. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But for some, there are fates far worse than death on the battlefield. There is the slow corruption of everything that makes us human, the gradual transformation of consciousness itself into something that serves purposes we cannot accept, but can no longer resist. This is the true horror of the Dark Mechanicum, not what they do to the body, but what they do to the soul, turning it into a willing participant in its own destruction. The Emperor protects, but even his protection has limits. When those limits are exceeded, when the faithful fall into hands that understand consciousness better than they understand themselves, the result is not martyrdom but corruption on a scale that threatens the very concept of human identity. This is what I learned in the depths of that Hirtech facility. This is what I became in service to masters who had abandoned humanity entirely. And this is why someone must know, why someone must understand what waits in the dark places where the enemies of mankind pursue their blasphemous research. Because knowledge is the only defense against corruption. And ignorance serves only those who would see humanity transformed into something that wears our faces while being utterly alien in its essence. The dark Mechanicum grows stronger with each passing year, each successful integration bringing them closer to their goal of galactic conversion. In the name of the Emperor, in the memory of what we once were, remember Marcus Kellen and learn from his fate. For in the darkness between the stars there are things that hunger not for our deaths, but for our souls, and they have learned to make us grateful for their attention.